Are you curious about Emmanuel Todd's Defeat of the West? It's a book many people are talking about, but it hasn't been translated into English, so it can be a bit hard to really get into these really interesting creative ideas that Emmanuel Todd has offered about the Ukraine war, the defeat of the West, and the sort of cultural, social crisis going on, particularly in the United States of America. Well, there is good news. There is a new way to read the latest geopolitical analysis by Emmanuel Todd, and to do it in English. I completely understand the frustration people have about this. Emmanuel Todd and his publishers have chosen, for whatever reason, to translate a Defeat of the West into 20-odd languages, but not into English. And I have done a number of videos on Emmanuel Todd, including a complete guide to Emmanuel Todd's Defeat of the West, which you can get by being a paid subscriber at jeffrich.substack.com. But Emmanuel Todd does have a bit of a reputation as a prophet, so a lot of people are interested in his ideas. He predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1970s. He predicted the decline of the American empire in the middle of the unipolar moment in 2004. And in 2023, over 2 years ago, he predicted the defeat of the West in the conflict in Ukraine. So he has quite a track record, and what's more, he has a very engaging style that is both serious and deep historical, sociological, anthropological understandings, but is also witty, engaging, and he presents in a quite charming way. But you have to understand French. So his approach is a deep socio-cultural approach rather than the common, rather shallow geopolitical analysis that you see in a lot of places. So the good news, though, is that Emmanuel Todd has just established a Substack, the sort of newsletter, blog platform that I also write on at jeffrich.substack.com. And he has presented there his most recent speeches, including a speech in Hungary and a speech in Russia, both in French and also in English translation. Yes, you can now read the main ideas about Emmanuel Todd's defeat of the West as expressed by himself in English at his Substack. And of course, you can watch my videos on Emmanuel Todd. You can try to read a translation yourself or watch, but I think probably the best and quickest way into his work is by reading his piece, his lecture in Hungary from April 2025, which is published on his Substack, and there's a link in the video description below, called Diverging Populisms. Now, Substack says it's about a 30-minute read, and I just want to give you a quick overview of this piece in this video and really encourage you to check it out yourself, because he is one of the more interesting, I think, creative and insightful commentators on these big changes. So in the lecture, he gives a bit of an introduction to his own biography and his work. In fact, he had visited Hungary in 1975, and it was partly that visit that stimulated his speculations on the fall of the Soviet Union, his correct predictions of the fall of the Soviet Union. And in the lecture, he does also speak about that prediction of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And people like Neil Ferguson and others are comparing the United States these days with the Soviet Union. Todd says that although he did see the collapse of the Soviet Union coming because of declining infant mortality, he did not anticipate the depth of the social and moral unwinding. What he calls dislocation, which can refer to a disturbance of a system or disruption or disorder, you could even say. He says here, the fundamental reason why I was unable to understand or anticipate the dislocation of Russia itself is that I had not understood that communism was not simply a means of organising economic activity in Russia, but also a kind of religion. It was belief that allowed the system to exist, and the dissolution of that belief represented, of course, something at least as damaging as the dislocation of the economic and indeed the social system. This is important for his most recent analysis. In his most recent analysis, he argues that things have moved on a little bit even from his book, The Defeat of the West, that the West has moved on from defeat into a similar experience to the Soviet Union of dislocation, or, if you like, social disorder. Here he writes, but we are now in the next phase, which is the dislocation of the West. And I have to say that just as in the dislocation of communism, of the Soviet system, I am unable to understand exactly what is going on. The fundamental attitude that we need to have now is, I would say, an attitude of humility. Everything that's happening, especially since the election of Donald Trump, surprises me. And I must say this, I find one of Emmanuel Todd's most appealing characteristics, this sense of genuine curiosity, of looking at the surprises of what's going on in the complex geopolitical historical reality that we're living in, and trying to offer better explanations than the sort of simplistic narratives that get thrown at you from all angles, from political leaders, from media, both mainstream and alternative. He looks for some of these deeper explanations with an attitude of humility, which I think is the best way, really, to approach learning from history. History, knows more than any of us. The lecture then discusses the main ideas of the defeat of the West, the nature of Russian social stability, and the reasons Russia was able to rebound from the dreadful, demoralising collapse of the 1990s, the long-term collapse of the West, democracy in crisis, looking at the clash between elitism and populism, which Emmanuel Todd locates in the sort of social the development of a new kind of social stratification in advanced societies built on higher education, built on the belief by university educated, the professional managerial class, if you like, that they are genuinely superior, that they have earned the right in almost a Protestantist kind of way to be among the elect. And then he also discusses the difficult concept of nihilism in his work on the defeat of the West. And I have discussed these in some of my videos on the channel, but I think it is really worthwhile, your while, going to Emmanuel Todd's Substack and reading it in his own words. And nihilism, the concept of nihilism or nihilism, some people say, is an important concept to focus on in his concept of this discussion of dislocation. If I just read an important passage here where he explains this concept of nihilism. Nihilism is born from a moral vacuum. It is an aspiration to destroy things, to destroy individuals, and even to destroy reality. Behind the slightly crazy ideologies that have appeared recently in the United States, and my goodness, have there not been a few crazy ideologies appearing in the United States and some other parts of the West? I'm thinking especially, Todd says, of ideologies such as transgenderism, which insists upon the possibility of changing sex, and Emmanuel Todd wrote a whole book on this issue, I see an expression of nihilism. Such ideologies are not necessarily the most serious examples, but they are expressions of nihilism all the same, a kind of impulse towards the destruction of reality. Then he makes the observation in his lecture that the Trump revolution, and he does see the turmoil of Trump's initial period in office as a kind of revolution in a fairly neutral sense, not in a positively valued sense, but a kind of sociological sense. The Trump revolution is born from military defeat. Again, this is a historical observation. Revolutions often follow military defeats. Think Russia 1917, think France 1789, in some ways perhaps even think the American Revolution in terms of British military defeat, and also think the Chinese Revolution as well. Think even perhaps the liberal revolution in Russia in the 1990s after Russia's defeat in the Cold War. Revolutions do often follow military defeats. And if war is a reality test, Emmanuel Todd says, then defeat brings a reality shock, the shock of defeat, and coming to terms with the bitter, difficult reality of actually being the defeated party in the war. Here he writes, defeat is a shocking reality check that triggers a collapse not only in economic terms, but also a general collapse of the Western belief in its own superiority. And aren't we seeing evidence of that all around the place right now? That's why we're seeing at the same time a collapse of the most advanced sexual ideologies, of the belief in free trade, and all sorts of other characteristically Western beliefs. The most useful concept to understand what's happening here is the concept of dislocation. And he argues that this moment of dislocation, and I do encourage you to read the piece to really fully understand this concept, which I can only briefly introduce you to here in this video, but he argues this moment of dislocation is affecting the transatlantic relationship, Europe and the United States, and it's also affecting the internal cohesion of the European Union, a sort of return to multiple nations, if you like. And he spends that last part of the essay discussing the different effects of this dislocation on three main players: Russia, Germany, and to some degree, part of what Emmanuel Todd means by a strategic defeat of the United States in the Ukraine war is an ultimate rapprochement between Germany and Russia. And in many ways, I think he believes that some kind of rapprochement between Germany and the European Union, certainly in the longer-term interests of Europe, and may well happen after all the shouting about the war is done. But his analysis of the United States of America is quite bleak and refers back to the concept of nihilism and dislocation that I referred to before. And in particular, he compares the collapse, the demoralization, the disorder, the dislocation in the United States today with both the collapse of the Soviet Union, the loss of religious belief, not just the political collapse, the loss of communism as a religious belief, and the moral collapse of Germany in the 1930s. There are many American thinkers who talk about the German question and use it as a tool to beat up Europe on or their political opponents on. And in some ways, this German question is about how the cultural centre of the world in the first half of the 20th century, Germany, really did descend into the horrors of what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s. And here, Emmanuel Todd, some of the concluding paragraphs from Emmanuel Todd is worth reading. I just want to focus on this particularly important warning, I guess, about how what's going on in the United States right now is something that one should be really concerned about, because it is perhaps not so dissimilar to what happened in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and not so dissimilar to what happened in Germany in the 1930s. He says, America was the pinnacle of civilization, and now I'm seeing this pinnacle of civilization collapsing. But this is the second time in history that the Western world has experienced a moral collapse of the most advanced of its member countries. In the early 20th century, Germany was the most advanced country in the Western world. German universities were leaders in research, and yet we saw Germany collapse into Nazism. And one of the things that made us unable to stop Nazism was that it was simply impossible to imagine that the most advanced country in the West could produce such an abomination. And here he articulates his deepest fear about the current moment. So my true fear at the moment, which goes beyond any rational argument, is that the United States is on the brink of producing things that we cannot now imagine. Terrible threats, and that they will be particularly terrible precisely because we cannot imagine them. Who could have imagined what's going on in the American universities right now? Who could have imagined what's going on in relationship to the advocacy of a genocide in West Asia? Who could have imagined the appalling fiasco of the Trump tariffs across the world? The moral collapse of America has been a major theme of my World History World Tour, which I'm doing at Substack throughout 2025, and my leg of that tour that looked at America in the first months of 2025. And you can dive deeper into that by becoming a paid subscriber and watching my American series of videos built on those Substack commentaries right here. And it is this deeper socio-cultural dimension of Emmanuel Todd's analysis of geopolitics and history that I also try to bring out in my Guide to Geopolitics and History, available for paid subscribers at Substack, and that I'm trying to offer here on the YouTube channel, something a bit different to the sort of day-to-day news analysis, the day-to-day commentary about wars and whatnot. I want to focus on this sort of different and unique perspective on the current situation. So do please like, share and subscribe so more people can discover both the fascinating ideas of Emmanuel Todd, and so you can learn a little bit more from history to live in tune with this changing world with me. Thanks for watching.